שמעתם פעם על דופמין? הרבה אנשים קוראים לזה הורמון האושר, אבל זה הרבה יותר מורכב ומסובך מזה, וזה עוד הרבה יותר חשוב בעידן שלנו. אז דופמין זה בעצם ניורוטרנסמיטר, שזה מילה פשוטה כדי לדבר על כימיקל שמעביר מסרים בין אזורים במוח, שאחראי על המוטיבציה ועל תחושת הציפייה שלנו כשאנחנו עומדים לקבל משהו טוב. עכשיו זה יכול להיות לאכול משהו טעים, זה יכול לקבל הודעת וואטסאפ מרגשת, וזה יכול להיות גם סתם לייק ברשתות חברתיות. אבל זה לא רק פרס, זה מנגנון שאחראי על כל המוטיבציה שלנו שעוזרת לנו לחזור על דברים שעשו לנו טוב בעבר. עכשיו, שהמערכת הזאת יוצאת משליטה, דברים מאוד גרועים יכולים לקרות. לצורך העניין, התמכרויות, חרדות, דיכאון. האורחת שלי היום, שהיא מומחית מספר 1 בעולם בדופמין, אומרת את הדבר הבא, שהמוח שלנו עובד או היה אמור לעבוד עם דופמין שמגיע אחרי הרבה מאוד ציפייה ואחרי עבודה מאוד קשה. אבל בתרבות המודרנית שלנו אנחנו מקבלים דופמין מכל דבר. אתה פותח פלאפון ויש לך כל כך הרבה דופמין, והדבר הזה יוצר באמת בעיות אמיתיות. חלק מזה זה הפרעות קשב וריכוז. אז בשיחה של היום דיברנו על דופמין ועל הספר החדש שלה שנקרא דופמין Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, שזה בגדול איך מסתדרים או איך מוצאים איזון בתוך כל כך הרבה דופמין זול שאנחנו מקבלים. בין היתר גם דיברנו על טיהור דופמין ועל כל מיני דברים אחרים. אנה למקה היא אחת החוקרות הגדולות ביותר בעולם בנושא דופמין, וזאת הייתה שיחה מרתקת גם בכל מיני הקשרים של האם דווקא תפיסה דתית שפשוט אומרת לילד לא כי אסור, כי ככה אלוהים אמר, יכולה לעזור לנו עם איזשהו בלנס של דופמין. ועכשיו פרופסור אנה למקה. Professor Anna, thank you so much for coming. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy and I'm anticipate and I think the your book is I encapsulated everything that we know about dopamine in the title. We are the dopamine nation, and it's not just the US, it's also Israel, and maybe it is the West. You please start by saying a few things about why we are the dopamine nation?
Yeah, thanks for that nice opening question. I think it's really a problem of modernity. I wouldn't even localize it to just the West. We are a collection of dopamine nations because through the application of science and technology, we have managed to drugify almost everything that we consume, including food, but also behaviors that we engage in, from shopping to playing games to sex to even previously healthy and still possibly healthy behaviors like exercise. What do I mean by drugify? I mean, we've made them more accessible. We've made them more potently reinforcing. We've made them more bountiful. And we've made them more individually tailored to our own needs. And as such, I think we're all struggling with compulsive overconsumption or addiction on some level in the modern age.
Now, many people say, or many people, and they're wrong, that dopamine is a reward. Uh, uh, you call it hormone or oxytocin or neurotransmitter.
Yes.
What is a exact scientific way to call dopamine? Is it a
Well,
neurotransmitter?
yes, it's a neurotransmitter.
Okay. But
Yes.
but it's not a reward per se, it is more an anticipation. So maybe we will just what is dopamine and what is the difference between a reward and an anticipation? Because I think that those things are quite different.
Well, they are different and yet they're related. There's so we know that dopamine is the reward neurotransmitter in the sense that when we do things that are pleasurable or reinforcing, that temporarily increases dopamine firing above our baseline tonic levels. The faster that dopamine is released and the more that dopamine is released, the more likely that substance or behavior is to be pleasurable, reinforcing, something that we want to do again. The controversy here has to do with whether dopamine is a signal that tells us that's something you should approach and do more of, or whether it's actually the source of the pleasure that we feel. And this is controversial. Um, is it the dopamine itself that gives us the hedonic pleasure, or is it that the dopamine is paired with other chemicals like endogenous opioids that give us the pleasure? And honestly, this is uncertain in the area of the science, but I still think it's furthermore, let me just add that we know also that we will get a hit of dopamine, not just in response to the reward itself, but also in response to reminders or triggers of that reward. So just to encapsulate that, if you train a rat to know that when it sees a light, it can press a lever and get cocaine, it will get a little bit of dopamine hit, increase in dopamine firing when it sees the light, even before it gets the cocaine. Now, when it gets the cocaine, it will get a lot more of dopamine released. So that's a very nice example of how dopamine is this anticipatory signal that when we know a pleasure is coming in the future, we get dopamine. But I think because we also get a lot of dopamine when we get our reward, and in general, things that are rewarding are things that we subjectively experience as pleasurable, I like to think of dopamine as related to both pleasure and reward, and the anticipation of reward, at least initially. And again, here's where the time scale is very important. So in initial exposure to something that's our brain identifies as important for survival, something pleasurable, we do get a big hit of dopamine in response. But over time, that diminishes, and then we can get to a point where we really don't get any dopamine in response to that habitual reward. In fact, it might immediately give us the opposite. And now dopamine is no longer about pleasure. It's purely about motivation. It's about trying to get out of that dopamine deficit state.
And again, I think that you are emphasizing two things. One, and this is maybe a big philosophical question. What is a ratio or what is a balance between the anticipation of something and the reward itself? Because you say, listen, when you have like see the light, it gets dopamine, but when it gets the Coke, it will get much higher dopamine level. Maybe, people tend to see maybe the anticipation is much more rewarding than the act itself, because we tend to think, wow, it might be great, it might be great. And the idea of anticipation, the act itself, it is very, but the other thing that you mention is the process is very addictive. You can be addicted to dopamine, and this addiction, I think, is no different than any drug addiction. This is purely drug addiction by nature, no?
Well, certainly it is true that anything that releases dopamine and gives us a subjective experience of pleasure is something that has the potential for addiction if it becomes drugified. And I think that's a really important point. Um, in and what does it mean again to be drugified? It means if it releases a lot more dopamine all at once than our brains evolved to tolerate. So our pleasure pain balance or our reward system really did evolve for a world of scarcity in which we would have to work very hard to get a tiny little bit of reward. We now live in a world where we don't have to do any work at all. And at the touch of a finger, we have access to these instantaneous, highly potent rewards that release a lot of dopamine all at once. So this cycle of addiction is really in response to the presence of highly potent and accessible rewards in our ecosystem that require almost no upfront work, that put our brains out of balance. So it's not that every cycle of anticipation, motivation, reward seeking, and reward finding will cause addiction. It is this interaction between our reward pathway and the way that it evolved and the world that we live in.
I think your answer leads me to my next question, which is about dopamine detox or dopamine fast. Now, we have many, many YouTube videos about how to do dopamine detox and why is it so important. And I think that the main issue about dopamine detox is that we need dopamine. It's very important, but we don't want the cheap dopamine of watching Netflix or junk food, having casual sex. We want something that is more meaningful, and we want to get dopamine out of meaningful things. And as a top world expert in the science of dopamine, what do we know about dopamine fast or dopamine detox?
Well, that's a phrase that has, sort of emerged as a kind of trendy lingo to describe whenever we decide to forego or avoid our particular drug of choice for a period of time. Whether that's a substance that we ingest or a behavior that we engage in, we commit to not doing it for a period of time. That's what dopamine fasting is referring to. And, the concept of dopamine fasting has been around for millennia, right? Almost every major religion has a period of time, which coincidentally or not, is about a month, where people give up, some kind of rewarding behavior for that period of time. And what we're finding treating patients with addiction, including many different types of addictive behaviors and substances, that when people abstain from their drug of choice for 4 weeks, they initially feel worse in the first 10 to 14 days. It's extremely difficult. But if they can push through that period and get to week 3 and week 4, they tend to feel better. And they feel better, not just better than they felt in the first 2 weeks of withdrawal, but often better than they have in a really long time. And the hypothesis is that that period of abstinence allows the brain to reset reward pathways by upregulating, dopamine production and transmission back to healthier baselines. So that's what we're talking about with a dopamine fast. Now, I will say that what has become trendy is kind of like the tech bro Silicon Valley dopamine fast, where they go into a cave for a week and then emerge and get high just looking at a little green leaf. And that's the same concept. I mean, it is the same idea from the, perspective of what may be happening in the brain, but it's not what we're doing here in clinical care. It's not practical for most people. And it's also just not the target. We're targeting a very specific substance or a very specific behavior that's clearly become problematic in that person's life. Cannabis, alcohol, nicotine, online pornography and compulsive masturbation, online shopping, online social media, video games, online gambling. These are the specific behaviors that people come in with and say, this is wreaking havoc in my life, or it's a problem, or I don't even think it's a problem, but my spouse does, or I'm just wondering if it's a problem, or that's not even my problem. I'm depressed and anxious, and could you fix that? And are realizing that, wow, just a dopamine fast or an abstinence trial from the drug of choice might actually help this person's depression or anxiety without our having to do anything else. So that's kind of how we're implementing it in clinical care. And it's completely adapted from what we've seen in patients with severe drug and alcohol addiction who are able to stop for a month and find that not only does the craving get better, but their mood gets better, their sleep gets better, their energy gets better, their whole sense of well-being gets better.
What you said is very interesting because many people, as you put it, don't even know that they have a problem. It's not my problem, it's my my problem or it's not my problem, but I'm depressed. So question number one is, what percentage of your patients or of of people consider this addictive behavior like online pornography and online gaming and shopping, etc., as a core problem? And the first chapter in your book, just a second, our masturbation machines. And it
Right.
reminds me that my wife's definition for masturbation is something that makes you happy but produces no values. So I think the idea of uh, it just makes me happy but has no value whatsoever, it is a merit or the gist of like cheap dopamine. So how many people, what, what is the percentage of people that don't even know they have a problem in addiction?
We don't have no there's that would be very hard to study. I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at that, but I can tell you from my clinical experience, I would say now, again, there's sample bias here because once people are coming into our clinic, somebody has identified that they have a problem, even if they don't. But even in that context, I would say about a quarter of our patients don't really think they have a problem, even when they have a glaring problem. Out in the general population, I suspect that number is much higher. Again, we have sample bias because people are coming in nominally for treatment. And when it comes to digital drugs, digital media, I suspect the number's higher yet because digital consumption is normalized. It's everywhere. You can't even get away from it if you want to. And I think that we are now dealing with a widespread population problem of problematic compulsive overconsumption of digital media that people are only just now beginning to be aware of.
And we have the books of digital minimalism, etc. So all the books that says maybe you consume too social media. I think the movie, The Social, a great example of how the like button can bring people life. And I think the idea of just a second. Let me put it. I lost oh, I lost my chain of thought. Oh,
No, that's
and
okay. That happens. I'm
no,
glad it
no,
doesn't happen.
no,
I'm glad I'm not the only one. It's so
no.
reassuring.
Nowadays, I tell you, when I did my master degree, and we had a very, very intense course in mathematics, and my friend who was me, as we study, took Ritalin or Atent or something in this context, and I said, "Oh wow, you are also in this ADHD thing?" And he said, "No, for me it's real." And then he explained, listen, I can learn to this boring subject in math, and out of nowhere, I can just open and see a YouTube video. So, wow, this is a definition of ADHD because I think I also suffer from ADHD. So, so I think that what I wanted to ask you is, what is the relation between, okay, how can we better ourselves, dopamine fast, and become better moral person by not subject ourselves to our desires and using drugs like Ritalin, Atent, etc.
So let me see if I understand your question. You're asking how can we better ourselves morally?
No, no, no. I think that we have two options when we want to deal with dopamine addiction. One is to do dopamine fast, or, constrain or take ourselves from the smartphone, from the online pornography, etc. And this is very hard. As you mentioned, the first 2 weeks are hell, okay? But we might have another, which is much easier, take Ritalin, to take a tent, to take drugs that help us be much more focused on our studies. Okay, I'm a I'm a professor at the academia, so many of my students, and I think, you know, the lion's share of my students take those drugs. So when should I say, listen, I need to work with myself, and not subject myself to my desire, and it will be very hard, but I will not touch the phone, and should I take Ritalin?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. It's a difficult one to answer because ADHD is a validated psychiatric diagnosis that our culture and our medical system recognizes. And many, many psychiatrists use stimulants as first-line treatment. Stimulants are themselves, dopamine agonists. And in the short term, they definitely help with sustaining attention, even if you don't have ADHD. And I think that's an important qualifier. And at the same time, we live in a world with constant distractions, such that, as you say, how are we defining this disorder? If we're defining it by, I felt the urge to open YouTube the moment I started my math homework, well, then we're all going to qualify for the diagnosis. So this is a tricky line to walk. I will say that I do think that ADHD as a brain difference is real. Okay, I do think it's very real that people have differing abilities to have a certain kind of sustained attention, especially for academic work. Some people are naturally much better at that than others. But I would just, from the 30,000-foot view, put forth the idea that maybe we're not really talking about a brain pathology when we see somebody with an ADHD brain. Maybe we're really looking at a brain difference. And really, people who tend to not necessarily have the ability to sustain a certain type of attention on specific repetitive tasks are often people who are very good at creative thinking or seeing patterns or seeing connections between disparate phenomenon or becoming fully immersed in certain tasks that they are very interested in, that encourage their own kind of flow, which again, then sort of like makes you question the idea that, is this an intentional problem or is this a specific type of attention that this person can't maintain? Anyway, the bottom line is that I really think that stimulants are now being used not to treat a brain disorder, but to adapt to a crazy world. And when I say crazy world, I mean a world that does require a certain type of attention sustaining ability in order to be successful in certain ways. So I don't know if I'm communicating myself clearly, but I have empathy for people who take stimulants so that they can fit themselves into the academic system, which requires and rewards a certain type of brain, which they might not have. At the same time, I really worry about this phenomenon because stimulants are potentially addictive. Even if you're getting stimulants for diagnosed ADHD, you can get addicted to stimulants. Even if you don't get addicted to stimulants, over time, because of neuroadaptation, they stop working as well, and people tend to need higher and higher doses. But even more importantly, people begin to self-conceptualize as being ill, as having a defective brain, and as not being able to do work without stimulants. So I will see people who got put on stimulants as young children who now believe that they are unable to achieve anything without stimulants. So then you've got a self-conceptualization problem, in my opinion, a kind of devaluing, again, your own brain, your own working style. The evidence shows that in the long term, people who take stimulants for ADHD do not perform better in school than people who don't take stimulants for ADHD, and that the best treatment long term is behavioral interventions. What does that mean? That means creating an environment that lowers the overall stimulation and distraction so that people who aren't good at tuning distractions out can optimize their ability to focus.
Great, which I think again leads me to my next. Just before, there is a great story about the man Erdos who took stimulants, and a friend of his said, "Listen, I think that you're." And said, "No, I'm not addicted." And they had a bet that he will ignore stimulants for 1 month, and after he said, "Listen, I'm not addicted, but month I couldn't do job, any work in mathematics, and it's your responsibility to take math 1 month backwards." So idea of one of the most uh, 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 smartest mathematician of the 20th century could not work without Ritalin, or I don't know what he took, is a very powerful idea. He couldn't produce any work of value without those drugs. And I think, again, it leads me, maybe the human hasn't evolved to such an environment with so many distractions. And if it hasn't developed to adapt to such an environment, the only thing that we can do is to intentionally say, okay, I don't want smartphone until the age of 30, and I don't want television. So we society needs to do something, which I think is crucial.
I
What's your take?
agree. Yeah, I mean that's the whole point of dopamine nations. Like we've created this ecosystem, this environment that now conspires against us. And in order to thrive, we need to either change our brains to adapt to this crazy world, or we need to change the world. And I'm in favor of changing the world, or at least in the short term, creating a world within a world where we have barriers between ourselves and all of these temptations and distractions, so that we can live healthier lives, healthier and happier lives. Because I really think that a lot of the mental health struggles, from depression to anxiety, that we're seeing at rapidly rising rates in wealthy nations around the world is not because our brains are not okay. It's because our brains were not evolved for the world that we have created. And acknowledging that and kind of figuring out, okay, what kind of world will be better for us. And I would say it's a world where we eschew immediate gratification and intentionally do things that take longer, that are harder, that are less convenient, and even things that are, to some degree painful, so that we can be more in balance with our own brains.
And I think, again, and in order to do it, we must say things are better and some things are worse, some things are good and some things are bad. And maybe the child doesn't know for himself what is good for him. We, as parents, as adults, need to introduce, need to educate, need to guide him or to guide them in the path of success. And I think the idea of, the common modern liberal idea of philosophy, child know best for himself, which, came from the philosophy of John Dewey, but Dewey never experienced TikTok. Okay, so maybe John Dewey is in the age of TikTok and Instagram, and we didn't adapt for the great philosophy of Dewey in our age. So we need to, or do a seance with Dewey and say, okay,
Oh, you just froze. I don't know. Did I freeze
okay,
for you too?
you froze for me and I froze for you. Okay, just a second. It's 028. I will cut it. Can you hear me? Anna? Anna?
Oh, yep. Okay, you just came back.
Okay, thank you. Okay, just a second. Ah, okay. Very, very strange. Just a second. It happened. Okay. So I will ask the question again, okay?
Yeah, it was.
And
The last I heard was about John Dewey, and John
yes,
Dewey wasn't in a world of YouTube
yeah,
or
yeah, what
TikTok.
yes, and what in your opinion, what can we do right now?
Well, I agree with you that we as parents need to guide our children, that indeed, until a certain age, they don't know necessarily what's best
Mm,
for them.
mm,
But I also think that many parents don't have access to the information that they need to know the extent to which digital media in particular is addictive. I mean, parents generally know alcohol, drugs, but I don't think most parents recognize the extent to which digital media really is harmful for kids. The other aspect of this is that even if you engage in a perfect kind of parenting, which none of us is ever going to be capable of, but we're gonna do our best. We're dealing with a school system, at least I don't know how it is in Israel, but at least here in the United States, where the entire school system has essentially bought into this idea that the more tech, the better, and has essentially abdicated their responsibility in many instances, to teach by just putting on some video or other, or allowing kids to access, all of their devices during school time. This isn't to blame teachers
mm,
either. I mean, I think teachers are struggling too. They're finding it more and more difficult to get the attention of students. But the point is that even if things are going on well in the home life, kids are forced to be connected and constantly carrying devices in order to function in the school system, or for that matter, in the workplace for adults later on. So schools need to take responsibility. Schools should not allow smartphones in the classroom, and that should be from bell to bell.
mm.
So it's not just that it's okay to have it during breaks or during lunch. Kids need to learn how to socialize and interact without being connected to the internet. And
Mm.
schools are the place where that needs to happen. The corporations that make and profit from digital media need to come to the table and do what they can to change the inherent addictive design of their products. We need legislators and government to help incentivize the kinds of behaviors that will help us help ourselves. So, in other words, this is not just an individual problem or even just an individual family problem. This is really a collective problem.
And I think that the way of communication, you just said that children need to learn how to socialize, and it is no joke. The way of communicating WhatsApp is profoundly different than the way of communication using phone or just face to face, because in a phone or face to face we have a conversation. WhatsApp, I tell you what, and that's it. Maybe you can tell me later. But the idea of response, of a conversation, of a two-side conversation, I think is profoundly different. And many people have, I think, inherent difficulties with just normal conversation. People prefer using WhatsApp or messaging, etc. Now, I want to ask you a scary question, and it is scary for me. I totally afraid of your answer. The book, the movie The Social Dilemma came out in years ago, and in this movie we have and they elaborated and many of the algorithm about social media that are so addictive. And basically, we have the alignment problem that we said to the YouTube algorithm or the Facebook algorithm, do whatever you can do in order to make eyes stick on the phone, on the screen. And those algorithms found that in order to attract someone, the content need to be more extreme and need to be more violent and you need to take you know, just one step. And my question is, years later, what do you think about current algorithms? Are they much dangerous than 5 years ago, or they're basically the same, or something better has happened during this time?
I missed one word there. What do I think about what algorithms? Just
About
algorithms
the,
in general?
about the algorithm of the social media, about the YouTube algorithm, the
Right.
Facebook
Yeah.
algorithm, the TikTok algorithm, etc.
Yeah.
Are they better or worse in a perspective as users they were 5 years ago when the movie came out?
They're no different, is my take on it. So, and that means they're as bad as ever. And you're absolutely right that by tailoring it to the individual with the recommended for you, the notifications, all of that is designed to keep eyeballs on that platform, to offer up content that we've liked before, but that's a little bit different, which then engages our treasure seeking function. And what that does essentially, because we then develop tolerance to same old, is that we have an inherent need for more extreme versions of the same in order for it to remain entertaining or stimulating or interesting or novel. And so the algorithm then pushes us to these ever more violent or ever more sexual, or, in the cases of kids who develop eating disorders, ever more extreme, eating body changes. And that accelerates the addiction narrative. And it also gets kids viewing this incredibly extreme, deviant content, which of course is, interesting, exciting, forbidden, but definitely, not healthy.
There is a place in your book when you write and you quote philosopher and theologian Kent Dunnington, and you quote him, "Persons with severe addictions are among those contemporary prophets that we ignore to our own demise for us who we truly are." I think that this is a great sentence, a great idea. If you could please elaborate on the idea of those uh, those temporary prophets.
Yeah, so I really love that quote. Kent is a good friend and a very deep thinker. And basically, what he's saying here is that we all have the same basic wiring for approaching pleasure and avoiding pain. And in this world of these constant uh, pleasures, at the touch of a finger, um, we are all vulnerable to addiction. And so people who have severe and life-threatening addictions, who manage to get into recovery, first of all, they show us who we really are, because we too have the potential to go down this road, especially with all of the new drugs that didn't even exist before, meaning we're all much more likely to find our drug of choice and to get addicted. But also, if people with severe addictions can get into recovery in this crazy drugified ecosystem, then they have a ton of wisdom to share with the rest of us. And essentially, that's what I'm trying to do in Dopamine Nation. It's not so much my wisdom, it's really the wisdom I've learned from my patients in recovery about how to live a meaningful, fulfilling life despite our tendency to get addicted. That's really what I'm trying to impart.
And another thing, and again, another great, very profound idea that I find resonant with all Jewish wisdom, and of the entire Jewish wisdom is about how to better yourself, how to excel, how to be more moral, how to work on your ethics. And it's chapter 8 in your book, which is radical honesty. And you that radical honesty can rewire the brain in such a way that it breaks the spell. And I think that, and please, to put words in your mouth, elaborate on what is radical honesty and why it's so important. And again, we are in a world that we lie time and special, and we lie to ourselves. So context that we also always, all day long, themselves, what is radical honesty and why it's so important?
Yeah, so thanks for asking. So radical honesty is something I learned about from my patients in recovery from severe addictions. Many of them got into recovery through 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, but some of them through other methods. But almost universally, what I have found is that patients in sustained recovery from severe addiction have learned through trial and error that they cannot lie. And of course, they cannot lie about their drug use, but they also can't lie about simple things like what they had for breakfast, why they were late for the meeting. Because what they discovered is once they start lying about the little things, that very quickly tips over into lying about the big things, and then they will relapse. And I just found that so fascinating. And I just really got curious about what is it about committing to doing our best to tell the truth, which, by the way, is very hard because we're all natural liars. We don't think of ourselves that way. But if you really start to pay attention, most of us will acknowledge that we tell several little lies through the day, seemingly innocent lies to sort of cover up our shortcomings or to make our life seem more interesting or dramatic or, what have you. But when we do that, what we're really doing, as you say, is we're lying to ourselves as well as lying to other people. We are removing from our conscious awareness facts about what is really happening in the world. And when we do that, when we have less access to truth, we have less information on which to base our decision making. And once we're basing our decision making on only partial information, it is inevitable that we will make decisions that are not as good. So I think one of the ways that this radical honesty works, this commitment to telling the truth about everything, especially not telling lies that make us look better in the world, what we're doing is we're augmenting our awareness, and we're probably activating the prefrontal cortex, which is that large gray matter area right behind our foreheads that's so important for autobiographical narrative, delayed gratification, appreciating future consequences. We're actually probably stimulating that part of the brain. And that part of the brain, it turns out, is integral to our reward network and functions as kind of like the brakes on the car in terms of consumption and appetite. So if those brakes aren't awake and fully functioning, we are not going to be able to manage our appetitive control. The other thing that's really interesting about radical truth-telling is that we're very reluctant to reveal to other people our own shortcomings or where we've messed up or things we're ashamed of, because we're afraid that people are going to reject us and go running away from us. But in fact, the opposite happens. And when we are, humbly honest and disclose these shameful things, people really open up to us. They want to be close to us. They see in us their own brokenness, and that's what really brings people together. So on many different levels, I think radical honesty is a great exercise. It's something that we prescribe to people when they're doing the dopamine fast. We say, okay, in addition to abstaining from your drug of choice, I also want you to tell no lies this month. You can't lie about anything at all, and it takes effort, and you got to set up a watchdog in your brain to pay attention to that. But I think that's all part of this recovery process. It does rewire the brain, I believe, and it strengthens those parts of the brain that are so important to awareness, to truthful autobiographical narrative, to delayed gratification, etc.
Wow. Telling truth just will rewire your brain. It's not the Lord will set you free, it is truth will set you free.
Yeah.
Ask a question that is, I think, beyond the scope of what you wrote in chapter 8, but nevertheless, it is my podcast. Okay?
Good for you.
And no. And the idea, I want to ask you, there is idea of politically correct. And politically correct basically means that there are truths that we prefer to ignore and not just because we're afraid that someone will get offended and we don't want to look in the eyes of the truth. And as a nation, and I talk about the US nation, but basically also the liberal Israeli nation, we were so in the PC movement, then that we lie to ourselves all the time. And maybe the dopamine nation has something to do with the idea of radical dishonesty in our system. So it is beyond the scope of what you wrote, but would you please tell me what you think about my theory?
No, I mean, I think you're really on to something here. I think there's a contagion effect with, um, you know, truth telling, or its opposite, the lying habit, and that we live in this age of compulsive overconsumption, which I think really fuels the lying habit, not just on an individual level, but also on the level of society and culture. As I mentioned in the book, there's the famous marshmallow experiment where a small child is put in a room, given a marshmallow on one plate, told by the researcher, listen, I'm going to go away for 15 minutes. If when I come back, you haven't eaten the marshmallow, you'll get a second marshmallow. And basically, they just measured which kids could wait the full 15 minutes, which kids couldn't. The older the child, the more likely they were able to wait. But, even at the same age, some kids could wait longer than others. And that correlated with, various measures of future success. But they did an interesting variation of that experiment, which was they would tell half the kids, wait 15 minutes, but here's a little bell. And if within that 15 minutes you ring the bell, I'll come back before the 15 minutes is over. And what they found was that for the kids so for half of the kids, when they rang the bell, they came back. For the other half of the kids, when they rang the bell, they didn't come back. They just waited the full 15 minutes and then came back. And not surprisingly, for the kids who rang the bell before the 15 minutes was over, and where the researcher didn't come back, that kid ate the marshmallow, right? Because all of a sudden now you're thinking, oh, I'm living in a world where people don't tell the truth. And these adults who told me that they would come back when I rang the bell, they didn't come back. So I better take care of number one here and eat this marshmallow, because chances are very good, even if I wait the full 15 minutes, they're not going to give me the second marshmallow. So in a very interesting way, this kind of lying on a systemic level or a group level, it really breeds addictive behavior, because you get in this kind of survival mode where it's like, hey, I can't rely on the people around me. I can't rely on the future and what that's going to be like. I need to take care of number one.
Wow. I need to digest what you just said, because I heard that the famous marshmallow uh, later on there was a follow-up research that said that what distinguished the kids that ate the marshmallow from the kids that didn't eat the marshmallow were how wealthy they were, how hungry they were. But you are now saying something completely else. If you are in a world where people lie to you, it promotes and enhances addictive behavior.
Absolutely, because you get in kind of survival mode, right? Where what
Yeah.
is the point of me delaying gratification if I'm in this chaotic place where people are not going to do what they promised they were going to
And
do?
and I think the entire point of civilization is to det- is to get farther away from this basic survival mode. So I think there is another thing that I will ask you, and about, let's say that to educate our children you to postpone desires. I think, and the only place left for this kind of education is the religious framework, because the religious framework is the only place when you can tell a child, no, this is forbidden just because. No, no, why? You don't need to supply an explanation. God said so, okay? That's
Mm-hmm.
it. End of discussion. And in a secular society, you need to explain everything. So the idea of you cannot do it, and there is no explanation whatsoever just because. And maybe, there is a quote that is based on you knowing that there are some things that you can do, but you're not allowed to do, and you don't understand why. So maybe the idea, the liberal, the liberal society, the modern liberal society, is a great society, which, and I don't want to say anything about against the liberal society, but in liberal society, when everything needs to be explained and there are no taboos, it is very, very educate a child, just don't do it because, and there are no whatsoever.
Yeah, so interesting to hear you think about it and phrase it like that. I guess I come at it at a slightly different angle, which is the following. I think what has happened with what you call the modern liberal society, which I think is harmful, is primarily this idea that we can control everything. Whereas the religious framework, or I'm going to say the spiritual framework, acknowledges our need to be humble in the face of what we really don't know, and our need to acknowledge that what may seem like the right thing now is not going to be necessarily the right thing for greater humanity in the future. And so I think when you talk about, well, in the religious framework, you can't do it just because you can't do it, because our ancestors said you can't do it. And you're sacrificing to this wider wisdom or this ancestral knowledge. And it doesn't matter what it is. It's a ritualistic act that serves as a reminder of our need to be humble in the face of all that we don't know. And I think that there's value in that. Whereas in secular society, that doesn't really exist, right? What is there is like, we have ultimate control. We can change,
Anna,
we know it.
I had Steven Pinker on the show, and this was the very question that I asked him. When do you say, listen, thinking is not enough, and we need to go back to tradition? And he had no, I think, good answer. This is a very important question. And I think I heard any good answer to the balance between the tradition, the rational thinking is important.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. And I hope you think my answer is a good answer. I don't know. Maybe you're,
No.
but I understand exactly what you're getting at. I agree with you, except that again, I would phrase it a little. I would, when a child in a religious setting would say to me, well, why is it that we have to wear these clothes or eat in this way? Or, it doesn't, what's the purpose of that? To me, there is an explanation and there is a purpose, but it requires this sort of, we are humbling ourselves to tradition because humbling ourselves is a good thing. And it serves as a symbolic reminder to us that we are so small and the sea is so wide.
I think that your phrasing is beautiful. I have so much more to ask you, but unfortunately we are out of time. So with your permission, I will ask you just one last
Yes.
question,
Yes.
because you write so much, and your Google Scholar is fantastic. Okay. I'm just, I want to become an assistant professor. So I quotes, okay? But could you please give us or share with us one tip regarding how to be more productive, and you can focus academic writing if you want. Just one tip.
Yeah. So, well, what I think is so fascinating in modern life today is how we don't even need external distractions. We now interrupt ourselves. And I'm as guilty of this as the next person. It's like,
Wow, you just nailed it. We
yeah,
don't need external distractions. This is great.
yes, right. Because we're so distracted that our brain we can go for about 30 seconds and then our brain goes, wait a minute, where's the distraction? So what I suggest to people to do, because it's an interesting experiment, is notice that about ourselves. And when you get to that moment where, oh, yeah, my brain is wanting to turn away from this thing and to do something else and to be entertained or to be distracted, instead, I'm just going to pause here. I'm just going to wait. Like the way that a car would stop at a stop sign, I'm just going to stop and just wait and see what happens. Because what can often happen is with a deep breath and a pause, we can move through that. And when we do that, we can find ourselves being very, very productive. It's like, oh, wait a minute, I don't need to get anxious that I don't know exactly where this is going or what the next sentence is or how to solve this math problem. I can stop. I can notice my desire to be distracted and turn away and numb myself from my anxiety or uncertainty. And then I can gently move forward again. So it's a very small thing, but I found it helpful.
Professor Anna Lemke, you have given me so much material to digest and to think about. Thank you so much for your time, research, and for everything that you doing for humanity. So
Oh,
much.
well, thank you. Thank you for your wonderful perspective. I really appreciated your questions and especially bringing in the religious and the spiritual, which I do think is so important and so often ignored. So I'm really glad I got the chance to talk with you.
Okay, thank you. It was my true pleasure and privilege.
Me too.
Bye bye.